Welcome, everyone. I'm Kat Lloyd, Vice President of Programs here at the Tenement Museum. Thank you so much for joining us for tonight's conversation on the new release, Relinquished, The Politics of Adoption and the Privilege of American Motherhood. We are here tonight in Schneider's Saloon. You may recognize this space as one of many of our talks, and tonight we'll be looking at it from a slightly different angle. John and Caroline Schneider, married couple, ran this space together. And they hosted a space for relaxing, socializing for their neighbors, but also a space where people might be discussing who in the community needed support and the issues of the day. Saloons were social lifelines for mutual aid within German immigrant communities, maybe even facilitating the care of children whose mothers did not have the resources to take care of them. So tonight's conversation looks at the complexity of this question of who can and should care for children and the stories of women today. We, every day at the museum, tell the stories that are often untold of women, and tonight is no different. So it's my pleasure to introduce tonight's guests, Gretchen Sisson and Christina Baker Kline. Gretchen Sisson is a sociologist, researcher, and author who studies abortion and adoption in the United States. She's a researcher at Advancing New Standards in Reproductive Health at the University of California, San Francisco. Christina Baker Kline is a New York Times bestselling author of 8 novels, including The Exiles, Orphan Train, and A Piece of the World, an author and editor of 5 nonfiction books. Her novel Orphan Train looks at the experience of children sent west from New York City in the 19th century, something that may have happened to children even within this community of Little Germany in the past. Our virtual programs are made possible with support from the New York State Council on the Arts, with the support of the Office of the Governor and the New York State Legislature, as well as Con Edison. Additional support is provided by the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs in partnership with the City Council, the National Park Service, and the National Park Foundation. And of course, with support from you, our Tenement Museum community. Your contributions allow us to offer these programs free of charge. Your contributions in the chat also make these programs special, so please share your questions and connections throughout tonight's conversation and visit tenement.org for information on future programs and how you can stay in touch with us. I hope you enjoyed tonight's conversation and turn it over to Gretchen and Christina.
So nice to be here, Gretchen. I'm thrilled to be doing this with you in this amazing institution, this incredible room. As you know, I wrote Orphan Train a decade ago, and my story really begins here on this street. So my story, which is about children who are taken from their parents, many of them were not orphaned, even though it was called an orphan train, and put on trains to the Midwest, was what we now think of as a barbaric system. But at the time, it seemed very humane. And as I was reading to the people who ran it, and in fact, to many people, you know, there were 30,000 children on the streets of New York at that time without families or without homes to go to. So it seemed like a way to take care of what was currently a problem. One of the things I love about your incredible book is that you do a deep dive into, I think, this subject that is fraught for a lot of people in a new way. And as I was reading it, I was actually reading sections out loud to my husband because I remember when I was working on Orphan Train that I came across a community of people who really truly believe that adoption is not an answer. They're really anti-adoption advocates. And when you and I were talking earlier in the green room, I mentioned this to you and you said that you knew about that world a little bit. So my question to you to begin is, how did this start for you? Where did this idea for this book about the politics of adoption, now questions of Dobbs, I know that came out once you started. How did it all begin for you?
So a lot of my work on adoption came out of working in other parts of the reproductive justice movement. So working for an abortion fund, there's volunteering at the time, interning with an organization that supported pregnant and parenting young mothers, so teen moms, and really looking at the ways that adoption was continually framed as this panacea, this social good, right? We don't need to invest in abortion access if people have the option of adoption available to them. We don't need to invest in supporting vulnerable families if there's always adoption. We can just transfer these children from this family to this family. And I wanted to understand how that broader cultural conversation reflected or failed to reflect the actual experiences of the people that were living it. And that includes the relinquishing mothers that I interviewed, and it also includes adopted people who aren't the subject of my book, but I think are a large part of the driving force behind this conversation that you're talking about, of people who are really critical of adoption. And I think when people who are most impacted by a system are deeply critical of it, that's a suggestion that we as a culture should be looking at it a lot more closely.
One of the things that you talk about in your book that a lot of people don't dwell on is the impact on the relinquishing mothers and what it really is like. You interview lots of people and you take us through their stories. So first of all, what did you find that these mothers were saying, and how did you find them? What was this community that you created, that you found as you were researching the book?
So I found the mothers mostly by online recruitment, and then they helped other mothers find me. So when I initially began this data collection in 2010, message boards were still a really big thing. Yeah. And a lot of adoption agencies would have message boards for the mothers with whom they had worked. And I wasn't a member, obviously, I couldn't post on them myself. But once I had interviewed a few of the women who are really eager to tell their story, they don't have a lot of opportunities to tell their story, they would go post on the message boards and I would get a lot of responses. So there was a lot of that sort of snowball outreach that was really important. But I also wanted to make sure that I wasn't just tapping into a particularly critical vein of mothers. So it was good that I was getting them from agencies, from different support groups, from other types of online communities with a variety of political orientations to adoption. But what I found when I interviewed them was that most of these mothers really had wanted to parent. And that was a really big part of their story. That was why most of them didn't seek abortion care. They continued their pregnancies with the intention of raising these children. And they got to a point in their pregnancy where that didn't feel possible, either because of this accumulation of crises and setbacks or a more acute moment of real crisis that they couldn't overcome before the baby was born. But I think that for so many of them, this idea of adoption as a better life was really persuasive, right? This became the lifeline, that they were offering their child a better life by relinquishing them. And that's not unlike what the Orphan Train organizers were suggesting then, that this was a better life that we were shipping children off to in the Midwest.
Yeah, I was really thinking about how on the orphan trains, the children were told, your past is not your past, your parents are not your parents, your life begins essentially when you're taken in. And of course, the orphan trains were a labor program, so these children were taken in, most of them, the vast majority, not to be adopted into the household and to be the children in the household, but to be labor. One of the things that is kind of reminded me of that early period in your research is that you describe how the women giving away children a lot of times are ambivalent. And there's a grace period. There's supposed to be a grace period of that you sign papers, but you have 30 days, oftentimes, depending on the laws of the state, I think, to change your mind. But that actually, a lot of times, these private adoption agencies have the women sign early, even before they give birth. And they also do things like rope them into sort of having gotten treats from the potential parents, adopting parents, that they would then have to pay for if they don't follow through. And so it makes it financially punitive. And then there's this cycle where they just could not actually pay for it, even if they wanted to keep the children. That to me was shocking.
Yeah. I think it's important to remember that a lot of these mothers don't have their own attorneys in this process. So they don't have legal representation at any point. Oftentimes they'll be sharing an attorney with the adoptive parents, and the adoptive parents are the real client in this scenario, right? Yes. And so I think that a lot of the mothers I interviewed didn't have like really sharp legal clarity around what they had signed when. So they believed that once they signed a custody order to turn custody of a child over to an adoption agency or to the prospective adoptive parents, that they had revoked their parental rights. In some states, that's not likely true, or they might have a revocation period. But because they didn't have representation that could explain this entire process to them, they did not have a lot of awareness on what their rights were at any given point. They also didn't have a lot of clarity around open adoption and what that meant.
Right.
So a lot of
because there are no rules.
Right.
I mean, that was also interesting to me that open adoption is completely different depending on what people choose, and there aren't really any guidelines for it.
Some agencies put a lot of investment into discussing open adoption and preparing their prospective adoptive families to have open adoptions, which for people who are not deep in the adoption world, open adoption is just some type of ongoing contact between the family of origin and the adoptive family, including the child, after the adoption is finalized. But that can mean any number of things. And in most states, openness agreements are not binding. And so mothers will sign an openness agreement believing that it guarantees them some level of contact with their child, and then finding out later that they have no recourse if the adoptive parents decide to cut off contact.
Which it sounds like happens quite a lot, actually.
It happens. Certainly some of the mothers that I spoke with had been cut off completely.
Yeah.
Some of them just had a harder relationship, right, with the parents. They grew apart, they moved apart, right? All of these sort of challenges that make people change over time. And this is a lifelong relationship that you've signed on to with someone that you probably don't know that deeply. And so there was a lot of, if not complete cutoff, estrangement, struggle to keep that relationship really meaningful and focused on the child.
One other thing I noticed just before we get away from the legal stuff is that I was shocked, I guess, but not surprised in a way, to learn that, you know, when these women needed representation, the lawyers were often in cahoots with judges who made the decisions about, you know, relinquishing the child. So say they had a month to sort of figure out what to do. I mean, to keep the child, the judges would often put off the hearings way past the deadline, and then it was too late.
Right. Or if relinquishing parents decide that they do want to try to regain custody before their parental rights are fully terminated, it's not just saying like, oh, I would like my baby back now, please. Okay, here they are. It is instead, in some circumstances, they have to go before a judge and argue for their ability to retain custody of their child against the prospective adoptive parents. And adoptive parents almost always have more money and more resources and more power in this equation. And so very few mothers are successful.
It's such a complicated subject because I can imagine a lot of people listening to us, you know, if they are not themselves adoptive parents, they'll know people who are. And we do know, of course, how joyful that can be for adoptive parents. So your subject is a really fraught and complicated and personal one. Were you aware of that when you were working on the book? I mean, I guess I would ask, how did it affect you as you were working on the book?
So
your personal experience.
I mean, I started data collection for this book, as I mentioned, in 2010. When I was in graduate school working on my dissertation, and I finished data collection in 2020. I didn't work on it continuously in between, but I had these 2 points, and I was at a very different point in my life between as a grad student and then ending it as a mother of 3. And so I think that the way that I understood people's stories changed over time. And I think that the biggest way that they changed is because none of these women were relinquishing their children because they didn't love them or desire to have a relationship with them. The reason they were relinquishing is because they believed their child's survival or well-being was rooted in the adoption. And I think that when you can get to a place where you have convinced mothers that their children are better off without them, for whatever reason, again, that's a system that we should be looking at more carefully.
You also had an incredible statistic that, or line, I guess. There's another place that there's a statistic here, but
I got a couple statistics.
yeah, just one or two. But a woman said that if she had had, she said, it seems laughable now, but if I had had $1,000, I would have kept my child. I would have been able to. I needed $1,000.
Yeah. And people push back on that line, right? Because like, how far does $1,000
Right.
really go? But what she's saying is not, I need $1,000 to raise my child. In her case, it was $1,000 so that she could have had a security deposit to move into her own apartment.
That's right.
Right? For other mothers, they needed $1,000 because they discovered they were pregnant really late. They didn't have a chance to get ready to save up at all, and they just needed to buy that car seat and that crib so that they could feel like they had a little bit of preparation, something to bring the baby home to. So it's not, I need $1,000 to raise this child until they're 18.
That's right.
I need this small amount of money to get me through this immediate challenge, this short-term hurdle, and then they're going to figure it out. Right? And we forget how many millions of American families are constantly in that figuring it out stage, right? They just need to get back to that really hard baseline that we leave a lot of American parents in.
Right. I think what's knitted into the story of adoption in our country is a sort of savior complex, too, that you debunk in this book. There's one statistic I wanted to read, which was, research has found that a 5% increase in food assistance reduced states' foster care caseloads by up to 14%.
Yes.
A 5% increase in food assistance. I mean, stunning to me. All right, there are two short pieces I wanted you to read. So both toward the end, one paragraph, maybe start with that and we'll...
Sure. So this speaks again to the extent to which a lot of these women really wanted to be parenting their children, and really how that relates to the ideas that we have about adoption in relation to abortion politics. The desire that I found at the heart of many relinquishing mothers' stories is a narrative the desire to parent that I found at the heart of many relinquishing mothers' stories is a narrative lost in the rhetorical contrast of abortion and adoption. More often than not, adoption is not about saving babies from abortion. Instead, adoption is about transferring infants from mothers that have become convinced, by virtue of their poverty, their youth, or their single status, or all three, that they are poorly prepared to parent. While adoption has been framed as the political common ground in the abortion debate, supporting people in parenting probably ought to have been the goal that both sides of the aisle rallied around. Indeed, many of the types of reforms that work in the service of family preservation are widely about making parenting easier for all American families, and thus are often intuitive and popular. Most of the mothers I interviewed wanted to parent but could not afford it. How would they pay for stable housing, sufficient food, safe child care? The United States makes parenting uniquely untenable. Parents in other developed countries do not grapple with these challenges in the same way. Of countries in the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the United States ranks among the lowest in spending on family benefits, child care, and early childhood education, and yet is above average on gross child care fees as a percentage of average earnings.
You have some stark statistics that I just thought were fascinating. Like you said that in Iceland, the 1 to 9 children are adopted a year.
Yes.
I mean, and just the idea that having social programs where children, where expectant mothers can get help makes such a difference.
Yeah. And we have more people than Iceland, so it's
Yes.
not, but even controlled for that.
Even for controlled for
the
that.
United States has a remarkably high domestic adoption rate, really standing alone among developed countries in most of the world. And when you look at Nordic countries, Scandinavian countries, for example, in Denmark, Danish women don't relinquish their children. Adoption still exists, but those are transnational, international adoptions where children are brought into the country because you have a social safety net. Domestic adoption doesn't really function in the same way.
Talk about the baby scoop era.
Yes.
What does that mean?
Yeah.
And how does it function in the context of the whole story?
Yeah. So the baby scoop era is really tied from the end of World War II until 1973 with the decision in Roe v. Wade. And this was obviously the baby boom era. And this marked a period of really deeply coercive, secretive adoptions. This was the time when you would have girls and young women who became pregnant out of wedlock that were sent away by their families to maternity homes to give birth in secret. These were mostly white women. There have always been longer traditions of single parenthood and kinship care in communities of color. So it was really this white middle class phenomenon that sort of put conformative pressure on these young white women to relinquish their babies. And sort of like what you were told about the orphan trains, right? How, this is your new start, this is your new identity, forget your old parents. These women were told, forget about this baby, you're going to go home, you're going to move on with your life, and you're going to have children later in a more appropriate social context. Now, this really shaped private adoption as a practice of white people at the time. And I don't want to make it sound like families of color were protected from family separation, but they were separated for other reasons that had to do with social control, family policing, and less about meeting a gendered social control and really a market demand for white children that existed that has still shaped a lot of the practices around adoption today. And this idea that adoption is redemptive for people, for mothers, for children, that this is saving of babies. This comes out of this time when single motherhood, unmarried motherhood was really deeply stigmatized.
Let's talk a little bit about the difference between public and private adoption. It's complicated. I hadn't quite understood, despite all my research for Orphan Train, I hadn't quite understood that public adoption is really the foster care system and children sort of being put in that funnel direction. Private adoption often involves money in some way or another, and it's unregulated, which I didn't quite realize, that adoptions that are in the private sector are both unregulated and am I right that we don't exactly have statistics for all of it?
Yeah, they're unregulated. They're closely regulated in certain ways, right? We do have qualifications for adoptive parents. Every state has those. But the ways that pregnant people can be targeted with regard to marketing, what revocation periods look like, the legal rights of it, that's all very and underregulated, certainly. But I think that the broader question about the public system versus the private system involves people that are terminating their own parental rights. The public system involves the state terminating people's rights to their own children. And this gets back to the sort of differential systems that have led to family separation throughout our history, right? So you have white children that were separated from their mothers because there was a market demand for white babies. And you have families of color that are disproportionately impacted by the foster care system in a way that really reflects the way that they've always been disproportionately impacted by family policing measures.
Right. Wow. One of the things when I was writing Orphan Train that I interviewed a group of activist students at a university here in the New York area who were Chinese adopted girls who had sort of all found each other at school, and they had an organization, and they were pretty angry, a lot of them. What about that period? You describe in the book the sort of phases of international adoption, of people coming into the United States from Russia, from Asian countries. How long did that last? It was after the baby scoop era,
yes,
right?
Yeah.
And then how did it taper off? I don't think it's ended exactly, but what's happened?
Pretty close to ended. The uptick in international adoption started in the 1990s. And a couple of things were going on. We were far enough out from Roe v. Wade that the impact of that had really minimized unplanned births for a lot of people. So that was contributing to a lower amount. You also had less of a precedent for transracial adoption. So you did not have a lot of white families in the United States that were receptive to adopting children of color. So that had to shift in order for international adoption to take root. And sociologist Elizabeth Raleigh has studied this book, this shift in her book, which is called Selling Transracial Adoption, to look at this sort of market increase that happened during the early 90s from a lot of Asian countries, Russia, a lot of Asian countries, South and Central America. That continued to rise during the 90s. It peaked in 2004. In the early 2000s, that's when you see a shift to a lot of more African adoptions, or a lot of really high-profile celebrity adoptions from Africa at the time.
You describe, I think, Angelina Jolie.
I do. Yeah.
Madonna.
I do, yeah. And the whole rhetoric around these adoptions was that these were children that were orphaned in the AIDS epidemic. It turns out these children were not orphaned. Much like the riders on the orphan trains were not orphans, these children had living families. They just couldn't afford to keep them. 2004 marked the peak of international adoption, and then it fell pretty dramatically. And now there are, I believe, under 1,000 international adoptions into the United States each year that we know of.
Interesting. Yeah. So that cohort of children who are now young adults have a very
old adults. These are
yeah, true. But I'm thinking 90s. If it was really sort of happening in the 90s, I'm thinking if my own children are exactly that age, so in their mid 20s, right, mid to late 20s. There's this whole influx of people who now there isn't such a thing. It must be a very interesting cohort.
Yeah, and I think that these are, a lot of transnational, transracial adoptees of color are leading a lot of the organizing within the adoption community and a lot of the work to bring adoption into the broader work of reproductive justice.
Right.
And a lot of relinquishing mothers are really stigmatized and really silenced in their stories. And so thus the organizing and the advocacy that has happened around this has really been led by adopted people, and as a lot of organizing in this country by women of color.
Yeah, right. Well, and the other thing about transnational adoptions is that talk about the relinquishing mother not getting, whether it's open or not, there's really very little chance that you're going to have a relationship with.
Right, because you'll have, obviously you have geographic barriers, you have language barriers.
Yeah.
There's a lot of separation, and it makes it even harder to trace records internationally.
Yeah. You described one story that was fairly positive. It was Jordan, I believe. And I wondered, is that a model for other adoption stories? We can talk about that. But I also, a sort of a bigger question is, where do you go from here with this story? You've done all this incredible research. You've kind of uncovered the dark side, or the troubling side of what people like Amy Coney Barrett are suggesting is a perfect solution to the problem of
It's not the only thing she and I disagree on.
jobs. We can have another conversation about that. But before I get to that, Hillary Clinton and Amy Klobuchar also...
I agree with them on more things. Yeah.
You agree with them on a lot more. But a lot of liberals also have really felt strongly that adoption is an important and useful and valid path. So let's talk about that for 1 second.
Yeah. There are not a lot of things in American politics that we sort of have bipartisan support for, but I always point out that the Congressional Adoption Caucus is our largest bipartisan bicameral caucus in the federal government, right? This isn't something that is only happening on one side of the aisle. Both sides are really committed to continuing government investments, subsidies, tax credits to encourage adoptions to occur. I'm going to read just one more excerpt that speaks to this a bit. If we understand adoption as a practice intended to meet the needs of children and not the dreams of would-be parents, then the desires of those who wish to become parents through adoption are not truly relevant to whether adoption, as it is currently practiced, should continue to exist. Relinquishing parents do not owe anyone their child. Ultimately, adoption is an inherently conservative institution, one that represents a refusal to both support and care for American families at the most basic level, and one that precludes the conditions that make reproductive freedom possible. It is conservative in that it upholds regressive narratives about what types of people are worthy parents, but also conservative in that it offers a private solution to public challenges and shortfalls. So that's the last page, so spoiler alert, I guess. And I think
that point about a private solution to public problems is such a big takeaway, I think, from the book. And obviously we know that in many other policy areas, but in this one too, it was a shift in my own thinking about adoption and what it really is and what the cost is.
Yeah. Well, and I think, starting with that conclusion, it seems really radical to a lot of people. But if you can read the stories of these mothers that I listened to for 10 years, held close for 10 years, and you can come to a different conclusion, then I'd like to hear it, right? I don't think that there is another way to understand how the system is working and who it is truly serving. And I do want to go back, because you mentioned Jordan as a little bit of a positive story. And I think Jordan had a really complicated life.
Let's talk about Jordan.
Jordan was a young woman. She had grown up in foster care herself. Mm-hmm. She didn't have any connection to her own family. She was homeless. She was incarcerated for part of her pregnancy, but she was really happy when she was pregnant, right? And you can imagine that. She's someone who doesn't have a connection to her own family, right? This was her chance to have that relationship. Her adoption agency was good, offered good counseling, They helped her get into an Airbnb so that she could have a little bit more stability during her pregnancy. The parents were really open to having openness, and they're having her have an ongoing relationship with her child.
Gay couple?
Yeah, it was a gay couple. Mm-hmm. And she, when I had interviewed her, it was only about a year after the adoption, and she was sort of in like, okay, well, let's see how this goes mode. And I really want things to go well for Jordan. I am a little bit skeptical that things are going to go well. A lot of the mothers that I interviewed in 2010 felt great in 2010 when I interviewed them.
It was early.
Yeah, it was early in the adoptions. They felt really optimistic. They were going to have this great adoption. They had made this choice. They had great relationships with their child's adoptive parents. There was one young woman, Leah, I call her in the book, and I said, what should adoption look like? Every adoption should look like mine. And I talked to her 10 years later, and I say, you told me 10 years ago that every adoption should look like yours. And she said, yeah, sounds like something I would have said. My adoption was mostly unnecessary, and we're just kind of making the most of what we have.
So what's the shift in those 10 years?
So sometimes it's a really tangible thing that you can pinpoint, right? Contact is ended. People don't feel great about that, right? Or they become estranged. For Leah, what it was she had grown up in a really conservative household. She believed that children needed to have two married parents. That's what she was trying to give her child through adoption. By the time her son was 2 or 3, she was married. She had a stable income, and she was looking at the other family and actually felt like in some ways the child would fit better in her house with her and her new husband, who she thought would be a great stepfather for him. Mm-hmm. Other women who were in a similar circumstance, the adoptive parents got divorced and they were married, and they were like, well, we bought into this idea that adoption was going to offer them a 2-parent home that we could never give them. And now we're raising children with a new spouse, and the adoptive parents are divorced. Or they would have their own children a few years later and be like, they wouldn't be in very materially different conditions. So they're like, well, we're making it work now. Could we have made it work for that extra year?
Yeah.
So
you make a great point in the book about how statistics show that if a child grows up in a volatile family where there's strife for whatever reason. And of course, we know upper middle class families divorce as well. It's the same as having a single mother or worse. And so one of the things that I love that you do is you challenge our assumptions about what a better life is, a better life that these children are having an opportunity to get instead of waiting it out in a hard moment or providing bridges of money and of resources for these mothers to enable them to get to a place where they can be on their own, stand on their own feet.
Well, and one of the mothers I spoke with, she's like, I grew up really poor, and it taught us resiliency and creativity and how to come together and look out for each other. And she's like, and I bought into the idea that what my son needed to have for a better life was to be with someone else, right? And I don't think that we as a country value that. We certainly don't value families enough. We don't materially invest in families the way that we should. We don't make parenting possible, but we also don't recognize a value in keeping families together. We don't see that as having any intrinsic benefit for the child, let alone the parents who want to raise them.
I think there's a lot of lip service to that. I think that people act like they believe it, but as far as policy and, funding, that's where we really fall short.
Yeah.
It's all a political game. Yes. Thank you so much. We're going to open it up for questions. I think we're exactly on time for that. I'm sure that there are people in the audience who have questions for you.
Wonderful. So I'm going to open it up to the room first. Who has a question they'd like to ask?
Hi, thanks so much. This has been great. So just to go off of what you were just saying around keeping families together and being invested in that, New York City has tried to move very sharply towards keeping children with their parents, given the foster care situation in the city. But it's not always working necessarily. But I do think that is the right way to go all the time. Why can't we see that with adoptive mothers, with mothers who they're being pushed into adoption? That's obviously a situation where, if we could, we should keep those people together. Why is there a difference? There seems to be a little bit of a shift on the foster care front. Why not on the adoption front, I guess, is my question.
There's more demand on the private adoption side. Excuse me, my cough generously waited until we were done monologuing, but not quite to the end of the program. I apologize.
A little adrenaline drop.
Yes, excuse me. So we have this belief that we need more people to adopt children, or that this very altruistic thing to engage with the private adoption system. In fact, we have between 8 and 45 waiting families for every infant that's relinquished in the private system, which means that demand is very, very high and supply of babies is very, very low. And this is not true about the foster care system, right? You have more children than you have people interested in adopting from the foster care system. And so as long as there is a really high demand and really low supply, there is money to be made in facilitating these adoptions. And there are a lot of for-profit agencies, for-profit brokers that operate in the space between vulnerable families and agencies that target marketing to vulnerable people to convince them to engage with the adoption system. There's a lot of money being spent there, and they're very motivated to continue separating children from families because that market demand exists.
Lawyers, too.
Lawyers. Yeah, I mean, I think people have this awareness that private adoption is very expensive. It is. But as much as agencies are spending on lawyers, more than they're spending on services for expectant mothers with whom they're working, they're spending on marketing. They're spending on Google ads to reach out to pregnant people who, I have one anecdote in the book about adoption agencies that were geofencing abortion clinics, methadone treatment facilities, WIC centers, public hospitals that are targeting these places where vulnerable pregnant people might be interacting or visiting to send them ads for adoption agencies and prospective adoptive parents.
Piggybacking off of that, I just wanted to talk about or ask you how you, what role this played in the Dobbs decision, right? Because we had Justice Alito saying the infant or the domestic supply of infants and, really driving home that there is this idea that's prevalent in our society that these babies are objects to be bartered and sold. So can you just talk to that a little bit about how that played into that decision?
Yeah, so in the Dobbs decision, Justice Alito cites this report from the Centers for Disease Control that says the domestic supply of infants is low. Domestic supply of infants has actually always been low. In part of the book, and since the orphan trains, early in the 20th century, there was this shift from adoption and child removal as a basis for economic and labor,
yes,
right, that you talk about, to sort of this sentimentalization of having children as part of your family in a way that had nothing to do with economics. And since that shift that has created this high demand for infant adoption, who have very little labor value.
Utility.
Yeah. They're very cute, but they don't actually generate a lot
it's a whole different way of handling the idea of children, right?
But I mean, because there weren't a lot of babies on the orphan trains, right? Because they couldn't work. This is about labor, right? But so there was this shift in the early 20th century to be valuing children as children and parenthood as parenthood and not children as laborers. What does this have to do with jobs? Back to your question, which is that since that shift, we have always had more prospective adoptive parents desiring to adopt than we've had babies available. And Laura Briggs, who's a historian that I cite in the book, has always talked about how each generation has had this sort of panic about a shortage of babies, right, that she draws back on over a century of news coverage around adoption. So this is what Alito is drawing on, is that we don't have enough babies for adoptive parents, right? And that if you are a pregnant person who's delivered or is forced to deliver after being forced to continue a pregnancy that you would not have opted to continue, you have no concern that your child won't have an adoptive family. That's probably true, right? Because we do have so many parents that wish to adopt. But two things. One is that most relinquishing mothers didn't consider abortion in the first place. Second thing, which I will offer in response to Justice Alito, and this was what his fellow justices offered in response in the Dobbs dissent, is a research finding for a project that I worked on that found that even among people that are denied access to abortion, 91% of them will be parenting. So only 9% of them are going to relinquish for adoption. They don't view adoption as a meaningful alternative.
For all of these emotional reasons that you've talked about. Yeah.
Right. And we, as a result of Dobbs, as a result of people being forced to carry pregnancies on a timing and a position that they did not choose or prefer, they're far more likely to be parenting under those unchosen conditions than they are to relinquishing in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
Hi, thank you both so much for being here. I'm curious if you see a role for philanthropy, kind of how we've seen, really the development of so many abortion funds that are making abortion accessible, funding, travel, childcare. I wonder if you see a role for philanthropy in mobilizing around keeping parents with children. So I could see that working kind of like, different universal care, universal funding. But yeah, curious if you see a role for that.
I'm someone who very much believes in the power of philanthropy, but I also believe that a viable publicly funded social safety net is really the only thing that can address a problem of this scale. There's plenty of space in philanthropy to care for families. To keep families together, to offer this sort of meaningful path of support. One organization that I write about in the book and I think is really fascinating is this organization that's a collective of mothers who have lost children to adoption and adoptees. It's called Saving Our Sisters, and they do a lot of work for women who are being targeted for adoption or who have sign their termination of parental rights and do want to revoke, about helping them find lawyers, helping them find the support that they need to keep their families together. And they're very scrappy and passionate women, and I was glad to get the chance to include some of their stories in the book. And certainly there is a role for philanthropy in just helping to address the day-to-day challenges of American families that are living in poverty. But ultimately, the only thing that's going to grapple with the inequitable conditions that we have in American society today is a robust social safety net.
There's a part of the book where we alighted on where you talk about celebrities adopting babies from African countries, and I was thinking as I was reading the section about Zahara, I think her name is, the Angelina Jolie daughter, that whose family couldn't afford to raise her, that Angelina Jolie is so wealthy and could have actually, that gift of giving them some money to do that would have been a whole different option.
Yeah, but we only value care for children if it happens within the context of a legal defined parenting relationship.
Yeah.
Right. Mm-hmm. And so what benefit is it to her if a family in Africa is, but we put a lot of money into adoption. This is what people don't realize is the adoption tax credit is up to $16,000 per adoption. And you can claim that even if the adoption falls through. Right. This is in addition to state subsidies for adoption that also take place, in addition to payments for foster parents. Right. We put a lot of money into this system already. We just don't invest, like a fraction of that investment would help poor families. And that's philanthropic dollars as well, into nonprofit adoption agencies, into pro-adoption marketing campaigns. I mean, the state of Texas is investing millions of dollars into marketing adoption to Black and brown communities right now. They don't want to offer parental leave. They definitely don't want to offer abortion access, right? They don't want to offer early childhood education, child care. They don't want to offer any of those types of safety nets that would make people actually able to support their families or to access reproductive health care. But they will spend millions of dollars to tell them that adoption is the solution. So we're already spending this money. We've just chosen not to invest it in keeping families together.
Very well said.
So we have a few other questions from our online audience. The first one is about sort of the societal idea or belief that motherhood is a right. And the viewer is wondering sort of how that idea plays into the dynamics of public and private adoption as we have been discussing.
Yeah. I don't believe motherhood is a right. And I also don't believe that any person can parent any child at any time. And I think that when you get into spaces that are deeply critical of adoption, which I spent a good deal of time in these days, that's sort of the argument, is that you want children to be unsafe. Actually...
Wait, who wants children to be unsafe?
Anyone who's critical of adoption is willing to either impose motherhood on people or have children be in unsafe homes. I'm not interested in either of those outcomes. I just don't think either of them are borne out in what we actually see. Like, a lot of these mothers that are relinquishing could provide safe homes. One of the examples I include is a story of a mother who, she's a Black woman. She had older children. Her co-parent had passed away. She has a new baby, and she's dealing with postpartum psychosis. And she recognizes that she is not a safe parent for that baby. And it's an uncomfortable story to read, right? She's having these delusions. She's having these intrusive, unsafe thoughts. She knows better than anyone that this is not a safe home for her child right now. And she's worried that if she relies on the child welfare system, she's going to lose custody of all of her children. And in the book, in her story, the only place that she can eventually find for help is the private adoption agency. And so she ends up terminating her parental rights, losing all legal relationship to her child, so that she can retain custody of her older children, so that she can get the help that she needs to deal with this mental health crisis. this is not a crisis response, right? That, you know, when I spoke with her a couple years later, she was in a really healthy place. She had just needed this sort of crisis care to help her get through that time.
So what could have happened? That
Yeah.
she would have had funded psychiatric care?
I mean, she would have had to have, well, one, if the child welfare system were actually about preserving child welfare, offering that type of crisis care so that she could access the psychiatric care that she needed to become well enough to care for her child, then she could have maintained that, right? And actually, when I spoke with her again, she was remarried, and she was expecting again, and she had this whole healthcare plan that she had developed with her OBGYN of what if this happens again, right? This is what we're going to do, you know, but she just didn't have that. She didn't have that level of healthcare at the time. She didn't have anywhere else to go for support. And so the reason I bring up this story is because I don't want her to have that baby at that time when she's dealing with that crisis. She doesn't want her to have that baby at that time because she knows that she's not a safe parent for him at the time. But why was adoption the only lifeline that she could find that was available to her, right? And you know, another woman that I spoke with, she's actually not in the book. She spoke with me after the book came out. She said, well, I didn't relinquish because I was poor. It was just that I was 16 years old and it would have been unsafe to bring my baby to my house. And I said, well, was it safe for you? And she's like, oh no, of course not. And I was like, well, then we've already failed, right? If you as a 16-year-old don't have a safe home to be in, we have already failed you and your child, right? And so I think that these are the broader conditions when we talk about a right to parent. It's not saying everybody has to parent every child that they give birth to. And it's certainly not saying that everyone can parent a child at any time. But it is saying, let's look at the broader conditions that lead to family separation and consider whether it's worth keeping these families together and what that would look like.
We have a conversation happening on our YouTube chat about the practice of orphanages in the United States. And I'm wondering if either or both of you could shed a little light on, you know, perhaps what would make a woman, when orphanages were a more common practice, what might make a woman place a child in an orphanage compared to give the child up for adoption. Any light you could shed on sort of this historic practice or concept?
Well, I'll start with the history, but just when those children were put on the orphan trains, they often originated in orphanages here in New York City that were so overrun that they didn't have room for the children. They had nowhere for them to sleep. So the idea of sending them out on this continual pipeline that went for 75 years, trains across the United States, was a solution, a stopgap solution to this problem. And the orphanages that existed then, all of us have read Dickens. We know that it was a very different world in the mid-19th century, but even in the early 20th century, which I write about, there were still, a lot of these places were called things like the home for the feeble-minded. Kids were put into these places to rot, essentially. They were not places for recovery or rehabilitation or growing and getting out, or even just basic care. Yeah. So eventually the model of the sort of institutional orphanage was scrapped.
Yeah. I also think, though, that most of them weren't there because they didn't have living parents.
Right.
Right. Most of them were there because they didn't have families that could afford them, which I think this story is a continuation of that. And that's really what the foundling homes were, too. And that's like the safe haven baby boxes that we see today that also came up in the Dobbs oral arguments. That it's the same expression of relinquishment: the foundling home, the baby box, the orphanage, the adoption system, right? These ways of not having capacity to care for children the way they deserve.
And we're not even talking about the Irish laundries and that whole horrific.
Yeah.
And then the Native, which you do actually alight on the stories of Native Americans and people in Canada and what those institutional situations were for children.
Well, the Indian boarding schools which I think people have an increasing awareness of
Yeah.
today, led right into the private Indian adoption project.
Right.
That was this additional way of separating Native children from their families and their tribes and putting them with white families for the purposes of assimilation, and it was this better life. And then that really only ended with the Indian Child Welfare Act, which we continue to have legal challenges. I mean, just last summer, we had a existential challenge to the Indian Child Welfare Act in Holland versus Burkine. And, a lot of the stories in the book, not a lot, some of the stories in the book talk about the ways that adoption agencies really avert the requirements of the Indian Child Welfare Act and go out of their way to ensure that they can remove Native children from their families and tribes.
Yeah, it feels like those stories have just been pulled into the public eye. Even in the last 5 or 6 years, we've really, I think people are only beginning to understand what that landscape was like.
Well, and I think it's important to understand how all of that history, right? We look back at the orphan trains and see them as, as a family separation policy, as this sort of desperate, insufficient, social system. We look back at obviously the boarding schools and the Indian Adoption Project and see that as a deeply troublesome system. We look at all of these historic policies and we can be like, oh, well, that wasn't good. All the good intentions that were imbued with them at the time didn't actually make them good systems. The question is, can we look at the systems today that we believe are imbued with good intentions and recognize the flaws that are there?
Well, I would say that that period that you describe in the 90s and 2000s of bringing children from other countries, we now look back on differently than people did at the time, and that's not very long ago.
Maybe we could do it without the benefit of hindsight this time.
That's part of what your book is
what
all
I'm trying to
about.
do,
That's what you're doing.
Yeah.
I will say too that just in the chat there are a number of adoptees themselves just echoing and appreciating sort of the conversation that has been taking place.
Thank you for being here.
And yeah, I really appreciate everyone who's shared parts of their experience. To round us off with a final question, someone is curious to know, Gretchen, how would you like to see your book utilized as a resource moving forward, particularly in legal and policy contexts?
I mean, I think that we are a step removed from really a practical policy conversation. I can come up with policies, but what I actually think we need to do is to have a broader cultural reckoning with what the system of adoption means. And I think that once we do, that will allow us to have a more creative, innovative, supportive conversation about what it means to care for children and families. And then we can start getting down to rolling up our sleeves and figuring out what those policy solutions are. But first, we need to let go of the idea that the current system is serving them well in order to do that.
That's great.
Great. I think that's an important place to end. Thank you all so much for tuning in tonight. Thank you, Gretchen, for your support of the museum. Thank you, Christina, for joining us tonight. And take care. We hope you all come back for more events and take what you've heard tonight moving forward.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Christina.